Cornel West begins by insisting that treating race and class as separate arenas of struggle is a theoretical and moral error, because the lived realities of people are shaped by their position in both hierarchies simultaneously. To parse racial injustice from economic exploitation is to abstract away the ways institutions and practices were built to use one to secure the other. The divorce of the two concepts produces weak remedies that fail to alter the systems that produce suffering. Historically, the economic logic of early American capitalism was intimately tied to racial domination. Enslaved labor created surplus wealth for plantation owners and emerging markets. That wealth accumulation set patterns of property, investment, and social prestige that endured beyond formal emancipation. Thus race was a technology for making certain bodies exploitable in service of capital accumulation. Racism did not merely accompany economic exploitation, it enabled it. Narratives of inferiority and social othering justified unequal wages, unsafe work, and exclusion from skilled trades. Dehumanizing ideas reduced the social and moral cost of extracting labor value from black bodies and thereby structured labor markets in racially stratified ways. After emancipation, new legal and economic mechanisms continued to reproduce this dynamic. Systems like sharecropping, debt peonage, and convict leasing tied black labor to local economies under coercive terms that reproduced poverty and dependency. The formal end of slavery did not translate into economic liberation because racialized structures persisted in new forms. Segregation and Jim Crow functioned not only as social control but as economic architecture. Segregated schools, restricted job markets, and exclusionary business practices limited wealth building and skill transmission. Spatial segregation concentrated poverty and removed access to networks and capital that make class mobility possible in other communities. Policy choices in the 20th century often reinforced racialized class disparities. Programs and benefits were distributed in ways that favored white workers and neighborhoods, while many black citizens were excluded from the social safety nets that promote intergenerational security. These political decisions show how race and class are institutional projects rather than sporadic injustices. Housing discrimination and redlining created generational barriers to wealth accumulation. Denied access to mortgage credit and quality neighborhoods, many black families could not build home equity, which is a primary vehicle for intergenerational transfer of advantage. The resulting wealth gap is not a coincidence but the outcome of coordinated economic and political practices. Economic restructuring, especially the decline of manufacturing and the flight of jobs from urban centers, hit black communities particularly hard because the social safety and employment buffers were already weaker there. Job loss translated into family instability and the erosion of civic institutions that sustain upward mobility, demonstrating how class changes are mediated by race. The emergence of a black middle and professional class after civil rights victories complicated but did not erase structural inequalities. While some individuals gained access to new opportunities, the broader community often remained disadvantaged. This created internal stratifications where class position influenced how one experienced and responded to racism. Class within the black community changes the texture of discrimination. For middle-class black people, racism may manifest as exclusion from elite networks or tokenization. For working-class black people, the same racism appears as underemployment, hazardous labor, or precarious housing. The different modalities show why addressing racism requires class-specific strategies as well. Cultural dynamics such as colorism and status signaling demonstrate how class and race interact even within families and neighborhoods. Lighter skin or assimilated cultural markers sometimes confer social advantages that map onto class possibilities, while darker-skinned and working-class appearances can trigger layered stigmas that compound disadvantage. The dominant cultural narrative often individualizes poverty and racial inequality, attributing failure to personal choices rather than historical dispossession and structural constraints. This narrative protects economic elites by obscuring systemic causes and steering policy toward punitive, individualized solutions rather than collective remedies. Mass incarceration is a stark example of race and class reinforcement. Policing and sentencing practices concentrate in poor, segregated neighborhoods, effectively removing labor, political voices, and family cohesion from those communities. The carceral system therefore operates as both criminal justice and economic regulation, shaping class mobility through racialized punishment. Neoliberal policy shifts intensified the class dimensions of racial injustice by prioritizing market solutions, deregulation, and privatization over public investment in housing, education, and health. These shifts widened inequality and left communities with fewer collective resources to resist the compounded effects of race-based exclusion. Media and culture play active roles in masking structural realities. Celebrated individual success stories are used to suggest mobility is widely available, creating a mirage that one or two examples disprove systemic barriers. Token representation becomes cover for persistent inequality that operates at institutional levels. Politically, debates that force a choice between race issues and economic issues are false binaries. Prioritizing one to the exclusion of the other produces fragmented movements and diluted policy. A politics that fails to weave together economic justice and anti-racism will at best secure symbolic victories while leaving the material bases of inequality intact. An intersectional, integrated analysis recognizes that policies must be built to address cumulative disadvantage. This means designing interventions that combine labor rights, living wages, accessible education, justice reform, housing equity, and anti-discrimination enforcement in ways that acknowledge their mutual reinforcement. History also supplies examples of powerful cross-class, cross-racial coalitions that advanced both labor and civil rights agendas. When unions, religious communities, and civil rights leaders aligned, they mobilized broader constituencies and won structural gains. Such coalitions reveal the strategic necessity of linking race and class politics rather than pitting them against each other. Policy implications flow from the integrated diagnosis. Reparative measures, progressive taxation, job creation targeted to marginalized areas, universal public goods, and strong labor protections can collectively dismantle the scaffolding that sustains both racial and class hierarchies. These are structural remedies that match the scale of the problem. Ultimately, West's critique is moral as well as analytical, failing to see race and class as intertwined as a failure of moral imagination. The demand is for solidarity that recognizes shared stakes across lines and builds a politics capable of transforming institutions so that dignity and opportunity are not privileges of the few but rights enjoyed by all. Cornel West insists that economic oppression in America is not a set of unfortunate coincidences but a historical project. From the earliest days of colonial capitalism, the accumulation of wealth was built on the systematic devaluation and exploitation of black labor. This exploitation was not incidental to economic development, it was central to it, and the structures that grew out of that arrangement still shape contemporary distributions of power and resources. Enslavement created a template for extracting maximum surplus from human beings while denying them any share of the yields. Plantations produced enormous intergenerational wealth for white owners, while the enslaved, stripped of legal personhood, had no claim on the value they created. That original dispossession set patterns of property, investment, and political clout that persisted long after formal emancipation. The end of slavery did not mean economic liberation. Sharecropping, tenant farming, and debt peonage emerged as mechanisms to tether black labor to land under coercive terms that reproduced dependency and poverty. These systems maintained cheap labor pools and prevented meaningful accumulation of assets within black communities, perpetuating a cycle of economic precarity. The carceral economy became another means of exploiting black labor. Convict leasing and similar practices effectively re-enslaved people under the guise of punishment, providing private interests with inexpensive labor while devastating families and community stability. This was not an aberration but part of a broader pattern where legal systems served economic ends. Federal and state policies often institutionalized racial exclusions in ways that funneled economic opportunity toward white citizens. Programs like the New Deal and the post-war GI Bill, while transformative for many, were implemented in ways, through local administration, discriminatory lending, and segregation, that systematically left Black Americans out of the benefits of mass prosperity. Housing discrimination and redlining codified racialized access to capital. By denying mortgage credit, steering investment away from predominantly Black neighborhoods, and underwriting segregated suburbs, these practices prevented homeownership-based wealth building for generations. The spatial concentration of poverty that resulted limited access to schools, jobs, and civic networks that facilitate upward mobility. The shift in the late 20th century from a manufacturing to a service economy hit Black workers especially hard because the social and institutional buffers that once provided steady employment were already frayed. Plant closures, suburbanization of jobs, and employer relocation stripped urban communities of middle-wage work and the social institutions anchored to them. Labor market discrimination remains stubborn. Black workers face lower wages for comparable work, greater unemployment, and disproportionately high rates of underemployment. Occupational segregation channels people into lower-paying and less secure jobs, reducing lifetime earnings and the possibility of accumulating capital or retirement security. The school-to-inequality pipeline is another mechanism of structural reproduction. Because public education is heavily tied to local property taxes, segregated and impoverished neighborhoods fund schools that lack resources, experienced teachers, and advanced curricula. This educational disparity is both a symptom and a cause of long-term economic stratification. Mass incarceration functions as a system of social and economic regulation. High rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration in poor Black neighborhoods remove labor, disrupt families, and stigmatize re-entry into the workforce. Criminal records reduce employability and impede access to housing and public aid, effectively freezing many into cycles of marginalization. Welfare and social policy design have often been shaped by punitive assumptions that stigmatize poverty rather than alleviate it. Eligibility rules, benefit cliffs, and moralistic rhetoric discourage collective remedies and make public support hard to access, further entrenching economic instability for those most in need. Financial markets and predatory lending practices extracted value from vulnerable communities. Subprime mortgages, payday loans, and high-fee banking services siphoned wealth out of Black neighborhoods during crises, turning precarious asset positions into catastrophic losses and deepening the wealth gap. Tax and fiscal policy also play a role in reproducing inequality. Tax cuts that favor capital gains and wealth transfers concentrate resources at the top, while disinvestment in public goods and infrastructure shrinks the social wage that could support broad-based opportunity. The result is a policy regime that privileges private accumulation over public flourishing. Environmental injustice compounds economic burdens. Polluted air, contaminated water, and proximity to hazardous sites produce health problems that reduce work capacity and create health care costs that erode household stability. These burdens are disproportionately placed on marginalized communities, translating environmental harm into economic disadvantage. Corporate strategies of outsourcing, casualization of labor, and the rise of precarious gig work weaken worker bargaining power, depress wages, and fragment solidarity. Union decline has further diminished workers' ability to secure living wages and benefits, leaving many without pathways to steady middle-class status. Cultural narratives that individualize poverty help legitimize structural arrangements. When economic hardship is framed as moral failure or lack of effort, public sympathy for systemic remedies wanes. Token examples of Black success are used to argue that the system is meritocratic, obscuring the widespread, patterned barriers that persist. Political power asymmetries are central. Policy choices reflect the influence of well-resourced actors. Lobbying, campaign finance, and institutional bias shape laws in ways that protect existing wealth and make redistributive measures politically difficult. The political marginalization of the poor ensures that their material interests are underrepresented in decision-making arenas. Intersectionality matters because race and class operate through gender, immigration status, disability, and other axes of identity. Women of color, immigrant workers, and other multiply marginalized groups often bear compounded burdens, lower pay, greater caregiving responsibilities, and higher exposure to precarious labor markets, making single-issue approaches inadequate. Recognizing the underclass as a product of design rather than destiny reframes the moral and political stakes. If poverty results from policies, practices, and choices, then remedies must be structural: living wage jobs, universal health care, robust public education, affordable housing, criminal justice reform, and access to capital are not charity but necessary repairs to a broken system. Cornel West's critique insists on both diagnosis and ethics. To address economic oppression is to confront moral culpability and to reimagine institutions that affirm human dignity. Redistribution without recognition or recognition without redistribution will fail. What is required is a politics that transforms economic relationships while cultivating solidarity and moral vision. Understanding economic oppression in this comprehensive way invites a broad civic response. It calls for alliances across class and race, policies that target structural levers of inequality, and cultural shifts that restore the language of common responsibility. Only by treating the problem as systemic and intentional can society begin to dismantle the mechanisms that recreate poverty anew. Cornel West observes that one of the most complex consequences of the civil rights movement was the emergence of a new black middle class that gained access to institutions, professions, and privileges once reserved for whites. This transformation was in many ways a victory. It represented the breaking of long-standing barriers and the realization of a dream for many who had struggled under segregation. Yet West warns that this progress carried hidden dangers. The rise of a professional elite within the black community created new internal divisions that reshaped collective identity and diluted the moral energy that once fueled the freedom struggle. This new class divide, West argues, did not appear overnight. It evolved as opportunities opened up for a limited segment of the black population, those with education, connections, or geographic mobility, while the majority remained trapped in conditions of poverty, inadequate schools, and economic neglect. The civil rights movement dismantled legal segregation but did not redistribute economic power or reform the structures that kept wealth concentrated in a few hands. As a result, many who made it into the middle class did so as exceptions rather than as part of a collective transformation. For those who succeeded, assimilation into mainstream institutions often required adapting to the values and norms of white middle-class America. Professional success came with subtle and explicit pressures to conform, to avoid being too black, too political, or too connected to the struggles of the poor. This process, West suggests, eroded the spirit of collective resistance that had once defined black leadership, replacing it with a more individualistic, career-centered ethic. The emergence of this new black elite brought with it a redefinition of what it meant to make it. Success was measured increasingly by personal advancement, higher income, suburban homes, private schools, rather than by contributions to the community or participation in movements for justice. The language of moral responsibility and solidarity that characterized earlier generations gave way to a focus on prestige and consumption. This cultural shift left many poor and working-class Black Americans feeling abandoned. Those who had once been at the center of a communal struggle now faced their hardships largely alone. The institutions that once mediated between classes, churches, activist networks, and neighborhood organizations, weakened as middle-class families moved away or became preoccupied with maintaining their own status in competitive, often hostile environments. In this process, West argues, the Black Church, historically a source of both spiritual guidance and social mobilization, lost much of its prophetic voice. Many congregations turned inward, emphasizing personal salvation and prosperity rather than systemic change. The pulpit that once thundered against injustice often began to mirror the capitalist values of the larger society, offering comfort without challenging oppression. Media representations compounded the problem. The visibility of black celebrities, athletes, and professionals created the illusion of widespread progress, masking the deepening poverty in urban neighborhoods. Television and advertising presented a version of black success that equated liberation with luxury and upward mobility, fostering a sense of envy and division rather than shared struggle. This new visibility also served to reassure white America that the race problem was largely solved. The achievements of a few were used to deflect attention from the structural inequalities that continued to define everyday life for millions. West points out that this symbolic inclusion of a small elite helped maintain the legitimacy of an unjust system by suggesting that merit alone determined success. Meanwhile, urban poverty deepened under policies of deindustrialization, austerity, and mass incarceration. The gap between the stable middle class and the jobless poor widened, not only in income but in outlook. Many middle-class Black Americans began to see the poor less as victims of systemic injustice and more as moral failures, people who had not worked hard enough or made the right choices. This moral distancing was perhaps the most damaging effect of the class divide. When solidarity eroded, so too did the capacity for unified political action. The energy that once flowed through movements like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the Black Panther Party dissipated into fragmented causes, professional advocacy groups, and symbolic gestures. West insists that this internal stratification mirrors the broader American obsession with class hierarchy. The black middle class, in seeking acceptance within a capitalist system, absorbed its logic, the pursuit of personal gain, competition, and status. But by internalizing this logic, it inadvertently reinforced the very structures that continued to marginalize the majority of Black people. Cultural identity became another site of tension. Middle-class respectability politics, the emphasis on decorum, assimilation, and professional demeanor, often clashed with the expressive, defiant, and improvisational culture of the poor and working class. Instead of celebrating diversity within Black life, these differences became sources of judgment and shame. Educational institutions reflected this divide as well. Middle-class parents sought exclusive schools for their children, while public education in poor neighborhoods deteriorated. Access to quality education, once a rallying cry of the civil rights movement, became another marker of privilege. In many ways, West laments, the reproduction of inequality within the Black community began to mirror that of the nation as a whole. The psychological toll of this division was profound. For those who rose economically, success often brought alienation, a feeling of being caught between worlds, no longer fully at home in their communities yet never fully accepted in white-dominated spaces. For those left behind, resentment and mistrust grew toward the new Black elite, whom they saw as complicit in their continued suffering. In the political sphere, the influence of corporate sponsorship and electoral pragmatism further blunted radical critique. Many middle-class leaders pursued incremental reforms that left the deeper structures of economic inequality intact. The old moral vocabulary of justice, love, and sacrifice gave way to the language of policy management and market efficiency. West argues that this transformation represents not just a social shift but a spiritual crisis. The collective soul of a people, once animated by visions of freedom and solidarity, has been fragmented by the seductions of individual success. The struggle for liberation, rooted in empathy, courage, and community, risks being replaced by a struggle for comfort and recognition within the system. This internal divide has profound implications for the future of Black politics. Without unity across class lines, movements for justice become easier to divide, co-opt, or ignore. The poor become invisible, their suffering rationalized as the cost of progress, while the middle class becomes a buffer that stabilizes rather than challenges the status quo. West does not condemn the Black middle class for its achievements, but he calls it to moral accountability. He urges those with privilege and education to reclaim a prophetic vision, to use their positions not for personal gain alone but to rebuild bridges to the marginalized and voiceless. Solidarity, he argues, must become more than a slogan, it must be a daily practice rooted in love and shared responsibility. Ultimately, West's reflection on the new class divide is both diagnosis and warning. The dream of freedom loses its transformative power when it becomes privatized into personal advancement. True liberation, he insists, is collective, relational, and moral. It demands that those who have ascended remember the debt owed to history and the duty owed to those still struggling in its shadow. Only by healing this internal fracture can the Black community renew its strength, its vision, and its moral witness to a nation still in need of justice. Cornel West argues that one of the most deceptive features of modern America is the way mass media manufactures the illusion of progress. Television screens, glossy magazines, social media, and political speeches are saturated with images of Black achievement, athletes, entertainers, CEOs, and politicians who symbolize success. These representations create a narrative that racism is largely behind us, that anyone can make it with enough hard work, and that equality has been achieved. Yet beneath this spectacle lies a starkly different reality: communities still locked in cycles of poverty, schools in decay, prisons overflowing, and generations denied access to genuine opportunity. This illusion works precisely because it is seductive. People want to believe that the American dream is real and accessible to all. The sight of a Black president or billionaire seems to confirm that barriers have fallen. But West warns that such symbolism is a poor substitute for structural justice. Visibility is not liberation, and inclusion in consumer culture does not mean inclusion in power. When fame and representation are mistaken for freedom, moral vigilance declines and society grows comfortable with deep inequality. Media institutions, owned by powerful corporate interests, play an active role in constructing this narrative. Their focus on celebrity stories and personal triumphs shifts attention away from systemic issues like housing discrimination, wage stagnation, and police violence. The spectacle of success becomes a convenient distraction, allowing economic elites to maintain dominance while the public celebrates a handful of exceptional figures. West describes this as a spiritual problem as much as a political one. The constant exposure to luxury, beauty, and fame creates a hunger for material validation. The poor and marginalized are encouraged to measure their worth not by their character or contributions, but by possessions and appearances. In this way, capitalism transforms suffering into aspiration. Instead of demanding justice, people dream of escape through consumption. The entertainment industry, particularly music and film, mirrors this contradiction. Many cultural products that once expressed protest and community consciousness have been commodified into vehicles of self-glorification and excess. West laments how hip-hop, born from the pain and creativity of the streets, has in many cases been stripped of its revolutionary edge and turned into an advertisement for wealth and indulgence. What began as a cry for recognition has been converted into a soundtrack for capitalist desire. This cultural transformation numbs moral sensibility. When artists and media icons project the idea that happiness comes from money, cars, and fame, the collective imagination narrows. The language of justice, compassion, and sacrifice becomes alien. The moral vision that once animated Black freedom struggles gives way to a celebration of individual gain. The result is not empowerment but alienation, a population entertained but politically paralyzed. Political leaders are not immune to this dynamic. West observes that the rise of Black politicians in mainstream institutions has often coincided with the decline of radical political discourse. Representation in office has not necessarily translated into transformative policies. Instead, many leaders have been absorbed into the same systems of compromise and corporate influence that sustain inequality. Symbolic inclusion, West warns, can coexist with real exclusion. The media's focus on respectability and success stories also reinforces class hierarchies within the Black community. Those who fit the image of professionalism and consumer sophistication are celebrated, while the poor are portrayed as pathological or lazy. Television programs and news reports depict inner-city life through stereotypes of crime and dysfunction, further isolating the marginalized and legitimizing punitive policies. By shaping how the public sees Black life, the media shapes what society believes is possible. If every story of success is framed as an individual triumph, then systemic barriers disappear from view. Poverty seems self-inflicted, and inequality appears natural. West calls this ideological manipulation, a way of maintaining domination not through force but through consent, by controlling imagination itself. Consumer culture deepens this manipulation by making people complicit in their own oppression. The pursuit of branded lifestyles and luxury goods turns rebellion into market behavior. Buying becomes a way of belonging, even for those whose economic reality makes such consumption unsustainable. Credit systems exploit this desire, keeping people indebted while convincing them they are free. This illusion of progress also reshapes political engagement. When personal branding and social media visibility replace grassroots organizing, activism becomes performance. Outrage is commodified, resistance becomes a fashion trend. West criticizes this spectacle activism, a politics of image that rarely threatens power but generates endless commentary and clicks. The saturation of media with superficial positivity further weakens collective will. Images of success provide emotional relief in a world of inequality. People want to feel proud, not angry, so they cling to symbols of victory and avoid confronting systemic despair. West reminds us that genuine hope is not denial of suffering but the courage to face it without illusion. This false optimism is especially dangerous because it disguises pain. When suffering is invisible, it cannot be healed. When injustice is masked by entertainment, reform loses urgency. The very culture that claims to celebrate Black excellence ends up silencing Black struggle. In the glare of fame, the poor disappear. For West, the obsession with visibility and image is a sign of deeper spiritual decay. A culture that worships spectacle forgets how to feel empathy. When success is measured by attention rather than integrity, moral character erodes. People become spectators of injustice, watching rather than acting, consuming rather than caring. This crisis of meaning extends beyond race. The same media logic that trivializes Black suffering also trivializes human suffering everywhere. News becomes entertainment, compassion becomes fatigue. The emotional distance created by constant stimulation leaves society morally hollow, informed but indifferent, connected but uncaring. West insists that the antidote to illusion is truth-telling, prophetic witness that pierces the spectacle and reveals the real. Art, journalism, and education must recover their critical function, exposing not only inequality but the cultural mechanisms that hide it. To love truth in an age of spectacle is, for West, a radical act. He calls for a reawakening of moral imagination, to see through the glossy surface of consumer capitalism and rediscover the dignity of ordinary people. The true measure of progress, he argues, is not the wealth of a few but the well-being of the many, not representation in the boardroom but liberation in the streets. This reawakening requires reclaiming community values over market values. Collective joy, solidarity, and compassion must replace competition and envy. Media can be tools of transformation if they amplify voices of resistance and remind audiences of shared humanity rather than division and desire. Ultimately, West's warning is prophetic. A people who confuse visibility with freedom will mistake symbols for substance and comfort for justice. True progress cannot be televised if the cameras serve power. Only by turning away from the illusion, by seeing clearly the pain behind the spectacle, can society begin the difficult, beautiful work of real liberation. Cornel West concludes his analysis with a clarion call for a society that recognizes the inextricable link between race and class. He emphasizes that addressing one without the other will always produce incomplete solutions. Justice cannot be fully realized if policies target only racial representation while leaving economic inequality intact, nor if economic redistribution occurs without dismantling racial hierarchies. A truly just society must pursue both simultaneously, creating structures where dignity, opportunity, and moral responsibility are accessible to all. West envisions a politics grounded in solidarity. This solidarity is not mere sympathy or charity, it is a deep, active connection across lines of difference. It demands that those with relative power recognize their stake in the liberation of the marginalized and commit to shared struggle. Solidarity becomes the social glue that binds diverse communities into a force capable of transforming entrenched structures of oppression. Empathy is central to West's moral vision. To see the world from the perspective of the oppressed is to understand injustice not as abstract but as lived reality. Empathy nurtures moral imagination, allowing society to recognize both immediate suffering and systemic patterns that perpetuate it. Without empathy, policies risk being technocratic and detached, addressing symptoms rather than causes. Justice, for West, is holistic. It requires legal protection, economic opportunity, and cultural recognition. Laws alone are insufficient if they fail to guarantee equitable access to resources, education, and healthcare. Similarly, economic reforms must consider historical disenfranchisement and ongoing discrimination to be effective. Justice integrates the moral, social, and economic dimensions of human life. He urges Black leaders and allies to reject tokenistic measures that placate without transforming. Symbolic gestures, a few appointments to high offices, superficial reforms, or rhetorical declarations, cannot substitute for policies that dismantle systemic barriers. Leaders must aim for structural change, targeting both institutions of power and the cultural attitudes that sustain inequality. Corporate power, West warns, is a critical target. Economic elites wield disproportionate influence over policy, shaping markets, legislation, and media narratives to preserve advantage. Challenging this power requires both regulation and cultural accountability, ensuring that the pursuit of profit does not override human welfare or perpetuate historical injustices. Political courage is inseparable from moral courage. True leadership demands risking personal or institutional comfort to confront entrenched power. West emphasizes that moral vision is not optional but necessary for social transformation. Leaders must articulate ethical principles and then enact them, even when inconvenient or unpopular. The fusion of moral courage with economic democracy is central to West's prescription. Economic democracy means creating conditions where wealth, opportunity, and resources are broadly distributed and accessible, preventing concentration of power that undermines social cohesion. It ensures that economic participation is not limited to a privileged few. Education plays a pivotal role in cultivating solidarity and moral vision. Schools should teach not only technical skills but also ethics, history, and critical thinking. West argues that moral literacy, the ability to discern justice, empathy, and community responsibility, is as crucial as economic literacy in shaping a just society. Institutions of faith and community are also vital. Historically, Black churches, civic organizations, and social movements have provided moral guidance, leadership training, and platforms for collective action. West urges these institutions to recover their prophetic role, promoting ethical engagement and reinforcing bonds of solidarity across class lines. Public discourse must shift from competition and blame to shared responsibility. Media, literature, and art can cultivate awareness of inequality and inspire action. West believes that moral vision requires storytelling that illuminates injustice, celebrates courage, and nurtures hope, creating a culture where ethical reflection informs civic participation. Alliances across racial and class boundaries strengthen the movement for justice. West stresses that the struggle is not only Black or poor people's burden, it is a collective societal challenge. Coalitions built on mutual respect and shared objectives can challenge entrenched power more effectively than fragmented efforts. Policy design must integrate ethical considerations with practical interventions. Universal access to health care, housing, fair wages, and education are necessary but insufficient if they do not address systemic discrimination. Policies must aim for equity in outcomes, not merely equality in opportunity, recognizing historical context and contemporary barriers. West highlights the need for accountability. Leaders, institutions, and communities must monitor progress, address failures, and remain responsive to the voices of those most affected by injustice. Accountability ensures that reforms are substantive, not performative, and that moral vision is translated into sustained action. Cultural transformation complements structural reform. Shifts in societal values, prioritizing empathy, cooperation, and recognition of human dignity, reinforce policies and institutions. West argues that ethics and culture are inseparable. Laws without a moral culture are brittle, and morality without institutional support is fragile. Grassroots activism remains indispensable. Collective action, protest, and civic engagement pressure institutions to respond, holding power to account and maintaining momentum. West sees activism as both practical and symbolic, embodying the moral courage necessary for societal transformation. Hope sustains this long-term struggle. West insists that despair paralyzes potential. Only by cultivating hope rooted in moral vision can communities persist in the face of setbacks. Hope, in this context, is not passive optimism but active resistance, guiding strategy and sustaining solidarity. Intergenerational responsibility is key. Adults must model ethical engagement, transmit historical knowledge, and invest in young people's capacity for moral and civic action. West emphasizes that societal transformation is a long-term endeavor, requiring continuity across generations. Ultimately, West calls for a society where moral courage, empathy, and economic democracy converge. Liberation is not solely legal or material but moral and spiritual. By uniting hearts and structures, people can challenge both racial oppression and economic exploitation, fostering a society that values justice, dignity, and human flourishing. In this vision, the fight against inequality becomes a collective moral project. Citizens, leaders, and institutions are all tasked with nurturing solidarity, challenging injustice, and building a world in which race and class no longer determine life's opportunities. West's prescription is ambitious yet necessary. Only a society rooted in moral vision and mutual care can achieve lasting justice.